Hello everyone, we are just about to get started at 2:03 as usual. If you have any questions, please go ahead and type those in the comment box and we'll get on with it here in just a few minutes. Thank you. All right, it looks like we are ready to get started. So just a couple of things before we get going on the chapter for today. Just to remind you again, we are currently in week 6. On Tuesday, we covered chapter 13. Today, we're going to be covering chapter 14. The video is already up for chapter 13. I'll post the video for chapter 14 as soon as we finish today. You also have your exam review that you definitely want to take a look at before you go ahead and take that third exam this week. And again, I will drop one exam. So after you've taken your third exam, if you're satisfied with your overall grade, you do not have to take the final exam. You will still have to do one of the inquisitives next week, but after this exam, you'll just have one inquisitive left if you're happy with your grade. And on the subject of grades, I did just want to kind of remind you guys that the last day to withdraw from this course is May 12th. You do have to have the paper signed by me and everything turned in before 5 p.m. on May 12th. Now, I'm not worried about you guys that have been attending these streams, that are doing your work and things like that. If you are concerned about your grade or you're just not really sure what you need to do, please do send me an email or a text, and I can definitely take a look at your grade in particular. And if you happen to have missed anything assignment-wise throughout the semester and you'd like to work on that, I will accept anything that you still turn in as long as it's turned in before the end of week 7. You'll just need to email me and let me know what you've completed so that I can go back in and manually kind of take a look at those grades. And other than that, just another reminder about the discussion board assignment. So we talked about this a couple of different times through the semester, but there is this participation article forum. Again, this is a very brief assignment. It won't take you very long to complete, but please make sure that you get that done, because this being a class that was supposed to be on campus that's now moved to a technology-based scenario, this will be your participation grade for the course, which is about 10% of your grade. So you don't want to lose 10% on something that will take you about 20-30 minutes to really get completed. And other than that, I think that's all the administrative stuff I have for today. So if anyone has any questions about anything that I just went over, please go ahead and type those and I'll answer those before we hop off the call today. But let's go ahead and get into our PowerPoint for today. So chapter 14 is probably one of my favorite chapters that we cover in a Principles of Macroeconomics course. The reason that I like this chapter so much is because it's sort of a capstone for everything that we've covered so far. And by that I mean it kind of takes all of the concept ideas that you've already learned about and then sort of applies them to some real world things that have happened and gives you kind of more of like a history side of a lot of the different economic concepts. We'll also talk about some great macroeconomic debates today. So there's really kind of two main schools of thought in economics, and you don't have to necessarily be all or nothing on either one, but it's really good to kind of understand what the foundation and the reasoning behind these is. So for chapter 14 today, we're going to be talking about the Great Recession, the Great Depression, and great macroeconomic debates. On Tuesday, we talked about aggregate demand and aggregate supply. We looked at that model and kind of talked about, how we make assumptions based on that model and how we can understand things that are going on in the real world by understanding that model. We also talked a little bit about government policy and how that model is used to kind of provide insights on those policies. So that's just a little recap. The big questions for today, we want to know exactly what happened during the Great Recession and the Great Depression. I'm hoping that at this point in the semester, a lot of this will feel very familiar to you. And then the second thing that we're going to talk about is what are the big disagreements in macroeconomics. So the Great Recession and the Great Depression are two of the most significant economic downturns of the past 100 years in the United States. Now, obviously, since this textbook was written, things have significantly changed, and it's likely that our current situation will end up in this chapter in future textbooks once we kind of figure out what's going on. So in this chapter, what we're going to look at is various causes and effects of these periods, as well as differing policy viewpoints related to kind of escaping from a recession. And this is especially relevant today because there's a ton of economists out there right now, in the White House, outside of the White House, all over the world, that are kind of debating the best way to sort of escape what looks like the recession that we're currently getting into. So this is kind of something you can absolutely apply to your life right now. So the recession of 2008, sorry about that, is called the Great Recession. The official duration was 18 months, so from December of 2007 to June of 2009, making it the longest of all recessions since World War II. Now, the term Great Recession was coined to describe this particular period of time, specifically because it was longer than other recessions. It also had a greater magnitude than other recessions, and it was characterized by turmoil in the financial markets. Now, recall that a lot of uncertainty about recessions is directly related to the fact that we often really don't know how long recessions are going to last. And in addition to this, like we've talked about with regards to like our current situation and things like that, there are delays in data collection, and we really might not know about the recession until 2 months after it begins. So there's often a lot of disagreements about the causes of recessions and also the corrective policy measures that should be taken during a time of recession, much like what's happening now. And I think that we all can kind of make some assumptions on why that is. So why do you guys think that there's a lot of debate on what causes recessions and about the corrective policy measures that should be taken to kind of combat these recessions? I'll give you a second to comment on that. There's not a right or wrong answer here. It's simply an opinion, so don't feel nervous about that. But go ahead and type some comments in on why you think that economists disagree about these things, and then we'll talk about it a little bit before we move on. So I see Eric said unintended consequences, and that is absolutely correct. One of the reasons that economists kind of argue about the best way to sort of combat recessions, and Eric also said perhaps differing views on how the economy works, both wonderful answers. So anytime that we enact a policy, regardless of who enacts it, who comes up with it, there's always going to be unintended consequences. It's not possible to, craft and then push out a policy without some things that you didn't really intend to happen going on. And also, depending on which kind of school of thought you fall into, which we'll talk about a little bit later, people have different views on how to best help the economy. So not necessarily how the economy works, but how we can fix the economy and what's the best kind of course of action. So wonderful answers, and we'll definitely cover that a little bit more as we go further into this chapter. This is figure 14.1a from your textbook. And what this shows is comparative data on real GDP and the unemployment rate. So this panel compares the pattern of real GDP during the Great Recession and an average pattern of other recessions since World War II. Basically, to kind of illustrate the two paths of GDP, we set them to 100 at the onset. So you can see that over here, they both start at 100. During a typical recession, so real GDP will fall slightly, but then come right back to its original level. So you can see that this line has kind of some little bumps and curves, but nothing too crazy. This typically only takes about 1.5 years for it to get back to normal. Now, in contrast, this kind of orange-red line down here during the Great Recession, output fell pretty significantly, and then it recovered a lot more slowly than what is typical of, GDP numbers. In fact, it took about 4 years for real GDP to reach its pre-recession level in the third quarter of 2011. So in terms of recessions that we had experienced and things like that, the Great Recession was very significant in comparison to things that had happened since World War II. Now, this is figure 14.1b, and this is showing the monthly unemployment rate for the Great Recession as compared to an average unemployment rate across the other post-World War II recessions. So for a typical recession, the unemployment rate would climb to about 7%, and then it would decline after about 12 to 15 months. But for the Great Recession, the unemployment rate climbed all the way up to 10% in October 2009, which was 22 months after the recession began, and it remained at or near 8% even 16 months after the recession began. So that's very significant and very long term. The two panels here kind of indicate that the Great Recession was more severe than a typical recession because you can see that unemployment went much higher than it typically did, and it hovered at that higher rate for a longer period of time. Now, it's really hard to say with how early on we are into the COVID pandemic and kind of the economic effects of that pandemic, but it is kind of likely that we will see a line that is even higher than this Great Recession line for kind of the current events that are happening. So you guys are kind of learning about economics at an interesting time because things are going to slightly change and there will be a lot of new information for future economics courses. So kind of an interesting time to be in an economics class. So analyzing the Great Recession with that aggregate demand and aggregate supply model, we want to say what happened. So what happened here was we had trouble in the financial markets in 2007. Real estate values fell as a result of securitization. So that's mortgage-backed securities. Falling real estate values led to a systematic problem in the financial market. And then these markets kind of exhibit international independence. And because of that, it became a worldwide problem. Now, just to kind of unpack a little bit of what this slide says, in case this isn't something that you're incredibly familiar with, basically, home insurance and mortgage loans were being bundled into these kind of boxes. And these boxes were called mortgage-backed securities. And essentially, a lot of people were getting home loans that maybe really shouldn't have been, that were out of their kind of ability to really afford. And as these people were buying these loans, the companies that were providing the mortgages were then selling these mortgages in these big boxes on the stock market. And what people knew was that these mortgage-backed securities were performing very well in the stock market. It was a way to make quite a bit of money, and everything seemed to be going really well. Now, on the kind of backside of that, although people knew that these were doing really well, these boxes of these mortgage-backed securities were so intertwined and so complicated that a lot of the people that were purchasing these didn't exactly know what was in them. It was almost impossible to kind of untangle these boxes. So as the market started to do badly, people were very shocked to see that these mortgage-backed securities were just tanking. And that wasn't something they expected. It was something that we probably should have known better. But up until that point, you have to realize that home prices had never done anything but really significantly risen over time. So it was a little bit unbelievable the way that things started to unfold. So in considering the causes of the Great Recession, most economists and policymakers initially just assumed that it was caused by a significant decline in aggregate demand. And while aggregate demand was falling, it's really clear kind of in hindsight that aggregate supply also fell. So widespread financial market turmoil is indicated as a decline in the long run aggregate supply. Remember, that was that kind of vertical line curve. A decrease in the loanable funds meant that less investment happened and also less capital was purchased. And that ultimately caused that long run aggregate supply curve to shift to the left. Now, we're not going to watch this video, but I absolutely would encourage you, recommend that you go and watch the movie Wall Street, Money Never Sleeps, or Too Big to Fail. Both of these movies are wonderful, and they honestly make economics much more interesting than a lot of classes will. But these movies give a really good explanation of exactly what came down with adding kind of like a theatrical element to it. But Wall Street, Money Never Sleeps is a very good movie that will give you a lot of really good insight on the Great Recession. Now, Eric said less supply, less demand, and failing institutions led to a recession. That is true. Not so much on the institution side, but the supply and demand were definitely major factors. So wonderful comment. Thank you for that. This is figure 14.2 from your book. And it's kind of showing you the FHFA home kind of price index. So home prices in the US began falling in about mid-2007, and they fell consistently throughout the Great Recession period. And an important thing to kind of note here is that home prices continued to fall even after the recession due to the severity and the depth of the recession itself. And you can kind of see that on this graph right here. And Eric said that he just meant the government, and that is true. Their kind of methods for intervening were not as successful as they had hoped. So all of these things sort of not only pushed us into a recession, but then in turn perpetuated that recession. So very good, wonderful observations. Now, analyzing the Great Recession with aggregate demand and aggregate supply, just to continue on that a little bit, let me go ahead and get this whole slide up. So figure 14.2 that we just looked at on the previous slide clearly shows a large drop in real estate prices or value. When stocks fell, for millions of people, this meant seeing their retirement savings drop by a full 1/3. Now, a lot of you might not have a ton of retirement savings yet or have a lot of investments in stocks, but I think even not having those items, you can kind of imagine that if you saw your stock portfolio or your retirement portfolio fall by about 1/3, you would start to feel very nervous. So together, these two factors led to a decline in wealth and a decline in expected income, which led to an overall decline in aggregate demand. Because again, when we start to think that we're not as wealthy as we thought we were, it makes us spend less, it makes us demand less. So because of this, there was a decrease in the long run aggregate supply and a decrease in aggregate demand, and both of these things contributed to the recession. Now, this is kind of an interesting thing that we haven't really looked at yet. It's called the Consumer Sentiment Index. It's figure 14.3 in your textbook. So the Consumer Sentiment Index is a measure of consumers' confidence about their own financial situation and also about the future direction of the economy. So this index began to fall pretty rapidly in 2007 and then fell significantly during the Great Recession. And the question that I have for you here is why? Why was consumer confidence falling starting in 2007, and why did it take a really long time for that to recover? So just from your own point of view, how do you think you would have felt about this, or how did you feel about this if you're, old enough to really remember that, and kind of give me like a reason of why people might not have been that confident in the economy and their own financial situation. Okay, Eric said, perhaps when they realized their portfolio started looking bad, some were not as confident, and that is absolutely true. As people started to see their stocks and their portfolios kind of tanking, they started to really worry about the future and worry about their own financial situation. And as we all know, consumer confidence is a major influencer on the economy. So wonderful comment. Thank you, Eric. Now, this is animated figure 14.4 from your book. Obviously, in your book, it's already all put together, but we're going to kind of work piece by piece. Before we get into this, I also see that Eric said, I remember being scared during that time as my mom said they may lose their jobs. And that's a lot of people were worried about that, and a lot of people felt that way. So that is a really big reason. Even people that didn't actually end up losing their jobs really kind of cut back on their spending because everyone was getting nervous about what was going on, much like how things are happening now. So wonderful comments. Thank you, Eric. On to figure 14.4. So this first clip, this shows us the long run aggregate supply curve in 2007. Now, this is the aggregate demand in 2007, and point A is kind of that equilibrium point in 2007. Now, this is where the long run aggregate supply curve was in 2008. So you can see that's a pretty significant jump over to the left there. And now the aggregate demand for 2008 and the new kind of equilibrium point, you can see that they both significantly moved backwards here. And you can see on the bottom here, let me see if I can get this to move. There we go. Oh, too far, sorry. You can see that our kind of natural unemployment went back. Our equilibrium scooted back a little bit onto that aggregate supply curve. So financial market turmoil and lower consumer confidence led to decreases in both the long-run aggregate supply and aggregate demand. And the result here was a new lower level of real GDP and a higher rate of unemployment. So these are both obviously not ideal scenarios. Now, just to give you some numbers here, let me pop up this slide and then we'll talk about it. One reason that this recession has been called great is that the decline in real GDP and the increase in the unemployment rate were very large by historical standards. Another reason is that the effects persisted for a lot longer than most recessions. So the second quarter of 2007, this is pre-recession, unemployment was down below 5% and real GDP was growing at about 3.6%. By the fourth quarter of 2008, during the recession, unemployment was up to 10% and real GDP was declining at an annual rate of 8.9%. So that's a pretty significant swing from one to the other. And by 2012, the recession had officially ended, but the effects of the recession still lingered. So the government employed a lot of different tools to try and move the economy back to normal growth and lower unemployment. We'll discuss what these tools were in the next couple of chapters, but the tools focus primarily on aggregate demand. In addition, a lot of world financial institutions remained in poor health for quite a while, and this really impacted aggregate supply. So this outcome kept a lot of economies from returning to normal growth rates, and this is something that's kind of interesting here because in a lot of economics classes and history classes and things like that, you'll learn about the Great Recession, and we talk a lot about the impact that it had on the USA and things like that. But what isn't covered as much is how we basically sent the entire world into a recession because of choices that we made here. So that's kind of significant when you think about the fact that the things that we're doing, or the things that another large country could do, can really have a very significant and very lasting effect on the world as a whole. So that's why we have to be very careful. Here's a practice what you know. What was one of the main catalysts of the Great Recession, which began in December of 2007? So I'll give you guys a second to answer that, and then we'll move on here. The correct answer is B. And Eric, I'm kind of wondering the same thing. I see Daniel commented, but if you're on. go ahead and let me know that you're here, because it looks like we're a little sparse today on the attendance. So the falling real estate prices were a main catalyst of starting the Great Recession, so very important. So coincidental, yes, Eric, and also parallels as far as people making decisions that end up, impacting some other people. Now, moving on to the Great Depression. I know for a fact that none of you were around for this one, because there's not many people that were around for this one that are still around and taking college classes today. So the Great Depression, while Great Depression and Great Recession sound very similar, the Great Depression was significantly worse. So that's very important to remember. A common misconception is that the Great Recession was almost as bad as the Great Depression, and this is very much not true. And the reason being is, here's some statistics for you. So during the Great Depression, the economy contracted by 30% from 1929 to 1933. It took 7 years for real GDP to return to its pre-recession level. Unemployment was 2.2% in 1929 and 25% in 1933. The unemployment rate was 15% for almost the entire decade of the 1930s. So you can see that there were a lot worse things happening with the same numbers during the Great Depression than there was during the Great Recession. Taylor, that's all right. Sometimes YouTube can be funny. It's very overwhelmed with the kind of volume of people using it right now, so absolutely understandable. But I appreciate you. Let me know that you guys are on here. This is figure 14.6 from your book. This is showing us the real US GDP in millions of 2009 dollars. So when we look at real GDP growth in the US over the long run, the Great Depression is pretty easy to spot. And I think that you can all kind of agree that this is a pretty significant little drop here. To normalize across percentage changes, the plotted data is the log of the real GDP. And remember that a percentage change is a difference in the different log levels. So World War II did help with the economy. Eric, that's a really great question. It was definitely one of the things that started to help us get that aggregate supply and aggregate demand back up, but it wasn't quite enough to pull us all the way out. So there were some policies that helped as well. But yes, that was one kind of assistance in that. Now, this is figure 14.7a. During the Great Depression, real GDP fell by almost a third. You can see this big drop right here. And it took about 7 years to return to that pre-recession level. And if you look at these declines in the Great Recession compared to the Great Depression, I think that this kind of really makes it a lot easier to see that the Great Depression was obviously much worse. An unemployment comparison, again, unemployment climbed to over 25% and remained over 15% for the entire decade almost of the 1930s and the Great Depression. And this really pretty far exceeds the Great Recession. So just to look at graphically and kind of give you that driven home idea that yes, the Great Depression was much worse. Now, this video just kind of shows what New York looked like during that time. It's from the original King Kong movie, so 2006 King Kong. I don't know if there was one before that. I'm not really a King Kong movie buff, but you can search. If you want to see what that looked like, you can send me an email and I'll send you that link for sure. All right, the Great Depression, aggregate supply and aggregate demand analysis. Let me go ahead and pop this up for you guys. So the Great Depression was characterized by some pretty unique conditions. Obviously, the effects were very deep and long-lasting. There were actually two separate recessions that happened here. 1929 to 1933 was one, and then 1937 to 1938 was the other. The most remarkable thing is that prices across the economy fell throughout the decade, and at the end of the 1930s, the price level was still 20% lower than in 1929. So this indicates that the primary cause of the Great Depression was that decrease in aggregate demand. Now, let me go ahead and go back a slide here. Eric was asking, why did it start to kind of jump up after that 8-year mark? And we will talk about that a little bit later, but basically it was kind of a combination of some policy things that were put into place that we'll cover in the next few chapters. And it was just kind of a result of consumer confidence starting to finally go back up. So you mentioned, World War II being sort of like a jump start of the economy. And that was a little bit part of it too, is that as, the war was starting to end and things like that, consumers started to feel a lot more confident. And that caused the jumps to start happening with aggregate demand. Now with unemployment, that was also a result of World War II kind of starting to come to a close. And the reason being is that during war times, there are a lot of jobs that arise that are not typical jobs, right? So a lot of people that are working these jobs during wartime, once we start to go back into peace times, those jobs become obsolete. And that's kind of something that was occurring around this time. And that was sort of the second recession that happened here. So wonderful question, Eric. Thank you. Okay, so looking at this graphically, this is figure 14.8 from your book, and this is the long-run aggregate supply curve. So in 1929, the economy was in equilibrium at point A. That's our 100 base year right here. We have aggregate demand in 1929. Unemployment was about 3%. Now, a significant decline in aggregate demand occurred for several years, and that was indicated by this pretty significant jump of that aggregate demand curve to the left, and they just kind of labeled that as 1930 plus because it happened for several years. And as we've seen in our studying of macroeconomics, the lower the aggregate demand is, the lower that our real GDP will be. So that's that Y1 figure down here. And you can see that in this model, unemployment rates got much higher, so around 25%, and there was a lower price level. So we had deflation down to this 80 right here. In a typical aggregate demand, aggregate supply model, point B would be considered a short-run equilibrium and designated by a lower letter, so a lowercase letter rather than this capital B. But here it's presented as a capital letter because it's indicating that this turned into a long-run equilibrium rather than a short-term spike. So what is true about the magnitude of the Great Depression? Very good. That correct answer is D. Unemployment reached a level of 25%, so that is very high. Now, some causes of the Depression. Let me go ahead and pop that up here. Macroeconomic policy. So what this is government kind of acting to influence the direction of the overall economy. And a lot of the Depression was caused by faulty macroeconomic policy. So economists distinguish two different types of macroeconomic policy. There's fiscal policy and then there's monetary policy. Now, fiscal policy is going to be changes in government spending, and changes in taxes is going to influence the macroeconomy, whereas monetary policy involves adjusting the money supply to manipulate the interest rates, affect inflation, output, and other macroeconomic variables. So just kind of an unrelated to this particular slide note, what kind of policy do you think primarily that stimulus checks were? Are they fiscal policy or are they monetary policy? Which one do you think that those would be? And kind of keep that in mind as we move through talking about the different types of policies. So we won't have a complete wrap up on that today, but we will cover that next week. So keep that one in mind. Now, the details of the macroeconomic policies, like I said, we're going to talk about those in the next coming chapters, but that is something I want you to start thinking about. But we'll kind of use the basics of fiscal and monetary policy to understand the Great Depression and kind of put some context in that aggregate supply and aggregate demand. So, causes of the Great Depression here. Let me go ahead and pop up this slide for you. The stock market crash in 1929 has become infamous. It's known as Black Thursday. There were a string of reactions that happened beyond the decline in the stock market that led to the Great Depression. So specifically, we had a pretty significant change in what people's expectations for the future were. And we know that expectations can, in a lot of cases, cause pretty significant things to happen. I'm actually not positive on if it was Tuesday or Thursday. So I want to say that Thursday is correct, but I could be wrong. Somebody Google what day October 29th was in 1929 and let us know if it was a Tuesday or Thursday. Because that could very well be wrong. I know that it's called Black something, Tuesday or Thursday, so remind me. If that's wrong, I will correct my slides. For anyone that's not sure what I'm talking about, Eric commented that in the history book it said Black Tuesday, so remind me, look that up and let me know in the comments, please. So we've talked about expectations. That's kind of where we were at here. So the government policy response and the stock market crash led to a pretty big decline in what people expected their future income to be. And then this also caused aggregate demand to fall. So it should say Black Tuesday. I apologize, that's a mistake in my slides. You know, we're getting close to the end here, but thank you for letting me know. I'm gonna make a note right now to correct that. So good catch. And honestly, I don't think that anyone's ever caught that in these slides. So that was just me making sure y'all are paying attention. I'm just kidding, totally a mistake on my part. So thanks for letting me know. The government policy response, so stock prices fell by about 90%. That's really significant. And the government policy response was that policymakers wanted to control stock prices. In response to rising stock prices, the government lowered the money supply. So that's going to be monetary policy. And as we'll learn in kind of future chapters, by reducing the money supply, interest rates will increase. Consumption and investment will decline, and this will lead to a decrease in aggregate demand. So basically, policymakers reduce the money supply with hopes of then in turn reducing stock prices. Now, obviously, stock prices did go down, but they went down much more than what they were hoping they would. So the reduction in the money supply and the resulting aggregate demand contraction led to financial panic. People started panicking, and individuals and banks. The panic among individuals and banks beginning to fail drove a lot of savers to take their money out of banks, which further reduced the money supply. Now, a lot of people don't really understand what does it mean exactly for a bank to fail. So what that means is that the bank can't meet all of the requests of customers that want to pull their cash out. When people panic, this leads to bank runs. So if you've never heard of bank runs, this is when large groups of people literally go to the bank hoping to pull out all of their cash deposits because they fear that there's a money shortage that's coming. Now, if the bank doesn't have enough reserves to go ahead and give everyone cash all at the same time, the bank fails and essentially goes bankrupt. And kind of remember, it's not feasible for a bank to keep 100% of their deposits in their vaults. Banks only have the money in vaults to return to depositors upon request, and the rest of that money they loan out to go ahead and make a profit. Now, these bank failures and bank runs were a major catalyst in the creation of the FDIC. So if you've ever kind of noticed what's going on here, if you've ever gone to the bank and you see the little sticker in the window that says FDIC insured, that is a direct result of the Great Depression. So the FDIC ensures a certain amount of deposits are going to be repaid by the government if a bank doesn't have enough liquidity to satisfy that demand. And this helps reduce the panic during fragile economic times. So because of things like the FDIC, we don't really see bank runs as commonly as we do today. So Eric, I see your comment, but I'm not sure exactly what you're saying there. So if you'll just expand on that for me a little bit. Yeah, and the FDIC does guarantee at least $250,000, but in some cases it's a lot more than that in areas where there's a larger population and a lot more deposits put in. So we're not going to watch this video. If you want the link, as usual, ask me for it. I'll send it to you. Now, an increase in taxes is going to reduce the disposable income that people have. So that's your income minus your taxes. Disposable income is what determines how much consumption spending you're going to do. Obviously, you can't spend what you don't have. So when we increase taxes, this reduces consumption and consequently is going to reduce aggregate demand. Tariffs on imported goods began a trade war. So this was some other factors that were going on here. In response, a lot of other countries started to tax U.S. exports, which decreased demand for U.S. products. And then a decline in exports reduced our net exports even further, and then decreased aggregate demand even further. So most analysts will agree that the economic contraction was primarily characterized by a significant decline in aggregate demand for the Great Depression. And in this context, the Great Depression was an event that reshaped the way that both economists and non-economists really think about the economy. So, yeah, okay, wonderful. Thank you for that. So Eric had said before that they were unaware that they were adding to it. And by they, he meant that when people were out doing bank runs because they feared that the money supply wouldn't be there, they didn't realize that they were actually contributing to that fear and contributing to the problem. So 100% true. And yes, I do remember Hoover vacuums. Okay, so moving to the next slide here. Let me go ahead and click that. We are going to talk about some major macroeconomic debates. So I'm going to pop all of this up so we can talk about it. So classical economists, the macroeconomic principles extend from microeconomic analysis. They kind of think that if prices for individual goods are flexible, prices across the entire economy are also going to be flexible. And they also believe that the economy will automatically kind of self-correct and come back to full employment in the long run. Now, Keynesian economists, they believe that adjustment will be long and occur unpredictably with many delays. They believe that prices are sticky, either up or down, and we'll talk about what that means a little bit more later. And they believe that the government should intervene in the market because the market by itself will not correct in a quick enough way. Now, it's kind of important to kind of caution that the classifications of classical versus Keynesian, these are given for simplicity. Not all economists are going to fit comfortably into either camp. Really, the more educated that you become, the less likely it is that you will fit into either one of these, specifically. But the distinctions between the two really kind of help you understand the source of debate. Okay, so classical economists and classical economics, I'm going to pop this up so we can talk about it. They believe the economy is self-correcting, so aggregate demand and aggregate supply framework, they believe that this is kind of the law of the land. They believe that in the long run, the economy will bounce back, it'll see full employment no matter what curves are shifted, and they believe that these adjustments are going to typically occur fairly quickly. Their policies, they're pro-market, which means they want the market to just do its thing, they don't want the government to intervene, and it's very laissez-faire, so very laid back and like leave it alone, let it kind of correct itself. They want no significant role for the government intervention in macroeconomic policy. They believe that government intervention is not going to help, it's only going to hurt. And they really focus on that long run growth, so the long run aggregate supply rather than just those short run shifts in the aggregate demand. So they believe that prices are flexible, and because prices are flexible and can be changed up or down, that the economy is essentially going to be self-correcting. No matter what factors change in the economy, no matter what curves shift, we'll always come back to full employment in the long run. And again, laissez-faire generally is going to imply a hands-off approach to the economy. So for example, no intervention, no need for policymakers to focus on these short-run fixes when the economy is over underperforming, because it will naturally kind of get back where it needs to be. So if you're a strict classical view kind of person, this is figure 14.9 from your book, we have the long-run aggregate supply curve, we have that aggregate demand line, and we have our original equilibrium point. This is showing a movement, so you can see aggregate demand has increased in this case, and then or decreased, either way. But basically, they think that only this long-run curves matter. So they don't really care in the classical view. All the focus is on affecting this natural rate of output by shifting long-run aggregate supply. So savings is very important to them. Savings is translated into investment. This increases capital. It keeps that long-run aggregate supply curve high and where it needs to be. And in this view, prices are going to adjust very quickly in either direction. So shifts in aggregate demand won't lead to changes in output or employment because the output level is going to stay at full employment. And when prices are completely flexible, aggregate demand is going to be less relevant to the kind of the overall health of the economy because changes in long-run aggregate supply are primarily going to be considered the source of economic prosperity. So they really just believe you focus on the long-run aggregate supply curve, and that's what matters. So Eric says, the government has a purpose in the market to apply boundaries to support market growth. So that is a very kind of Keynesian view. If you were just 100% a strict classical economist, you would believe that the government's purpose was to leave the market alone, that the guidelines that were already in place beforehand, that those were primarily what mattered. And obviously that's why nobody falls strictly into one or the other, because we do need those boundaries, like you're saying, to kind of keep things on track. So wonderful observation there too. Here is a practice what you know. Classical economists will generally focus on policies that will what? Very good. That correct answer is B. They will focus on policies that emphasize increasing that long-run aggregate supply. So that is what they care about. Now, the Great Depression and some economic theory for you. Let me just pop all this up. This is kind of recapping those conditions of the Great Depression that we've already talked about. But the Great Depression really challenged that view of classical economics. So real GDP fell from 977 billion in 2005 dollars, if we're adjusting here, in 1929 to 716 billion in 1933. So imagine an economic contraction so severe that after 4 years, the overall economy is producing about 30% less. Now, this is why the Great Depression fundamentally changed the way that people viewed the economy and the role of the government. It seemed clear at this point that the economy was not going to correct itself. It just simply wasn't possible. And thus, Keynesian economics was created. So remember, we talked about before how it's been said many times that tough economic times make for brilliant economists. And that's kind of true with Keynes, is that all this stuff is going on, and he's kind of looking at classical as kind of the only view that had really existed up until that point. And then you start to see, well, the economy actually can't correct itself, and that's where Keynesian economics came in. So Keynesian economics came from John Maynard Keynes, who was a British economist. Let me go ahead and pop up this slide here. Keynes believed that wages are sticky downward. So sticky downward meaning that wages by their nature are very reluctant to ever decrease, even in terrible economic conditions. We've talked about this a little bit where it's obviously not easy to just go and tell your workers, I'm going to pay you less because things aren't going well. So sticky downward means it's very difficult for them to go downward. Several causes of sticky downward wages. So wage agreements by unions, especially in the 1930s, very hard to decrease people's wages. The money illusion, people do not want to take a pay cut, especially in a recession. So in general, people are not willing to accept a pay cut. But, think about like right now with what's going on. If your work told you today, things are really difficult, so we'd like to pay you less, this would be the worst time for you to take a pay cut. Contracts and salary expectations, obviously if you signed on to work for a certain wage, you're not going to be happy to decrease that wage. So Keynes, he believed that an economy out of long-run equilibrium is not unusual. He believed that short-run economic circumstances could be improved through government intervention. And he argued that the government should try to shift that aggregate demand curve back to its initial level, and thought it was really foolish to kind of wait for long-run adjustments because in the long run, we're all dead. That's what he said. So Keynesian economists assume that prices are sticky downward, so they really focus on that demand side of the economy as the source of instability rather than that supply side. And so the major focus of Keynesian economics is that demand side of the economy, and that is the source of instability. So Keynes believed that short-run economic circumstances could be improved through government intervention, often, much like we're seeing now, in the form of stimulus. He believed that the government could boost AD by increasing government purchases, so G in that equation. Since consumers are really reluctant to kind of increase their consumption, that C of the equation, or investment, the I, he thought that waiting for the economy to return to full employment on its own was subjecting thousands of households to an avoidable period of misery. So his view on savings was really reflected in his quote when he said that, in the long run, we're all dead. He believed that savings was not helpful in the short run because it reduces that aggregate demand. So remember, we face a trade-off between saving and consuming. The more that we save, the less that we consume, and the more that aggregate demand will be reduced in the short run. And he believed that the short run was a crucial time frame. So the Keynesian view of the economy offered an explanation for the Great Depression. After the nation emerged from the Great Depression, Keynesian theory became entrenched in economics. So it became a really kind of important aspect of economics. Table 14.1 really just gives you kind of a breakdown of the different kind of, basic, very simple viewpoints of each school of thought. This is a great table to keep with you when you're working on your exam because it kind of breaks everything down very clearly all on one page. Today, the profession is obviously very mixed on this. So economists debate the continued importance of sticky prices, but they also debate the merits of government policy based on that Keynesian model. So you really won't find an economist that says, oh, I 100% believe in classical economics. And you really won't find an economist that says, oh, Keynesian economics is the only economics there is, everyone else is nuts. It's really a matter of dipping into both and kind of applying them in ways that will have the best effect overall. Now, this is just a dumb little video that your textbook kind of includes. It's an economics in the media slide. I don't know if you guys have ever watched some of these YouTube videos of the silly epic rap battles between different historical figures, but there is one of Keynes versus Hayek, and this one might be, something funny to look up. So if you're curious for something stupid to watch, this is, the thing for you. Let me know. So the Great Depression led to the creation of what school of thought in economics? Very good. That correct answer is B. And Eric, definitely look that up. I mean, I can't promise that you won't regret it, but, it's always fun to add some, outside things to our lessons. So what is the main reason that Keynes believed the economy won't return to equilibrium after a decrease in aggregate demand? So the correct answer here, we'll wait 1 second and see if anyone else messages in on that. Ooh, close. You were close. You had A or C, but it's not A. The correct answer on this one is C. It's mainly sticky wages. So remember, Keynes believes that government intervention is necessary. Classical economists are the ones that believe in, that the government intervention is ineffective. So close on that one. You just had the schools of thought backwards. And I'm not sure on the ERB, so if you let me know what that means, if it's something appropriate, which I'm sure it is. Now, in conclusion, in the recent Great Recession, we experienced lower output and high unemployment. The Great Depression was obviously much worse. It lasted much longer. Classical economists, they believe the market is self-correcting. They focus on that long-run aggregate supply curve, while Keynesian economists are going to believe in market corrections that they take too long and that wages are sticky, and that's why they take too long. So they believe that we should focus on policy that is aimed at aggregate demand. Generally, economists are going to believe that the economy can be self-correcting in the long run, but they're going to disagree on the relative importance of the short run and the long run. Oh, epic rap battles of history. Yes, Eric. Sorry, it's almost the weekend. My brain is fried. So if you guys don't have any questions, that is everything that I have for today. Remember, next week is our last week of lectures. So thank you guys. I am, proud, impressed, all of the above at how hard you guys have been working. Again, do remember that drop date for this class is May 12th. You have to have everything turned in by May 12th to be able to drop. If you're concerned about your grade, definitely, absolutely send me an email or send me a text so that we can kind of discuss what your options are and kind of see where you're at and that kind of thing. So other than that, I hope that you guys have a wonderful weekend. I hope that you're staying safe. And if you need anything at all, please send me a text message, call me, send me an email, whatever it may be. I'm here for anything that you may need. I'm going to go ahead and end this broadcast and post this link into our Blackboard folder. Please don't forget to take your third exam this weekend as well. So thank you guys. Have a great rest of your day and a great weekend, and I will see you on Tuesday.